their ideas through thorough and convoluted, sometimes treatises, point by point, developing a philosophical system. Okay? There is that kind of philosopher. That is the one kind of philosopher. Then there is this other kind of philosopher, a more primordial kind of philosopher, philosophia, meaning love of wisdom. This other kind of philosopher develops their philosophy through the art rhetorical form of dialogue. In later terms, the term dialectic took over from the word dialogue. I'm not so sure if I want to go there. I want to keep calling it dialogue. This and this and this and this. Unlike the first form of philosophy that I mentioned, which was developed academically and developed, with practice coming from like the Latin scholastic tradition. And it's grand and gorgeous, and there's nothing else like it, and it's thorough and it's rigorous. But this other form that I'm talking about, the dialogic form of philosophy, how its beginnings have been. This kind of philosophy began in the context of the conversation between the teacher and the student. And this form of philosophical understanding, this method, right, is so ancient, not only in quote-unquote Western philosophy, because let's mention, of course, one of the primordial figures, Socrates, whose philosophical expressions were uttered by him, spoken by him, never written down until his student, Plato, wrote them down, who wrote them down in the form of dialogues. One voice, another consciousness, and another consciousness, sometimes more than one, like in convocation. And this is another form of philosophical expression, of philosophical style, of literary style as well, of course. But it's more ancient than what Socrates had. Remember Socrates' mysterious references in the dialogues, as quoted by Plato, to his teacher. His teacher, Socrates had a teacher. His teacher, whose name was Diotima. Diotima, who knows if she actually existed or not. Diotima, though, Socrates referred to her significantly a handful of times. And he always referred to Diotima just before he would begin to explicate a metaphorical understanding out of just a really simple kind of like symbolic theme, almost like something out of folklore. And it was Diotima who opened the door for Socrates in this way. Archaic, you know it. Diotima, who could she have been? And what sources of wisdom could she have been in contact with? So we're talking about a mysterious and primordial tradition reaching back farther than what we understand philosophy to be in this day and age, or what we've habitually come to know it by. All of this is contained in that. And as well as, let us not forget the tradition of the Upanishads. And as I understand it, the word Upanishad means at the feet of. In other words, the form of the Upanishads, the ancient philosophical dialogic discourses of India, which arose from the tradition of the ashram, where the rishis and the hermits and the meditators would sometimes put it together in their minds and offer to the community at large, be it the village or the city or the royal household, the teaching of the ancient wisdom. And that too is a kind of a teacher-student kind of dialogue. All right. So those are two of the forms. I better do one more. And it's kind of a sport, you might say, kind of a genetic mutation. And that's the tradition that, this is partially playful, and that's granted, but that's the tradition that, let us say, it began much earlier than this, and I admit it from the start. But it began, as I say it now, provisionally, with Kierkegaard, with Soren Kierkegaard, the single one, the unique one, the solitary one. And he took from Socrates the persona of the gadfly. And he reached from farther back in his own mind, in his own tradition, than Socrates, to the traditions of the New Testament, which were, of course, fed from below by the traditions of the Old Testament, the traditions of the prophet, and the traditions of the sage, and the traditions of the particularly inspired teacher who becomes the central figure in what became a religion, but before it was a religion, that central figure who spoke in such a way that the very notions of reality were altered in the minds of those who were there. And speaking about New Testament, speaking about Jesus and all this other stuff, but for Kierkegaard now, and this is, like I say, a third elucidation of philosophical form. For Kierkegaard, in his uniquely watershed personality, which prefigured so many things for us in not only the 20th century, but on into the 21st century, in his own particular kind of melancholy anguish, Kierkegaard, haunted by his understandings of philosophical traumas that were inflicted upon him when his father stood on a hill and cursed God, a thing no child should hear. And yet, out of Kierkegaard, it became the sand grain that turned into the pearl of the philosophy of Kierkegaard. And the single one, the troubled notions of the single one. And along with that, an insight into the stylistic ways that his primordial predecessors had uttered their own, the speech of their soul, basically. And Kierkegaard sometimes put it this way, lyrically, vulnerably, nakedly, put it right before you. Other times, though, being a sophisticated stylist as well, he adopted tones of irony. He acted out, actually, different personas, different selves, almost, of writing, giving to us a corpus of writings that are mystifying, inspiring, and enriching on so many levels. And so what I will call that then is the tradition of just like Nietzsche is also in this tradition also. As a matter of fact, of course, he exemplifies it as much as anyone. The tradition of the solitary eccentric scribe, the individual, the prophet. It's partially the desert prophet. It's partially the one alienated from the community in a certain way. And yet, out of that very alienation, he takes the elements of the community that he's become familiar with in his imagination, and he expresses his philosophical insights, but from the perspective of an outsider. So let us call it that, the solitary outsider. So, there you have it, right? The academic treatise, the dialogic student-teacher convocation, and then the solitary outsider, the alienated visionary. I mean, you can see how it opens up into all further romantic permutations, of what an artist or a poet can be. Good. So you take these three things, these three forms, these three conceptions of what it means to express yourself philosophically in literature. Yes. And then you begin to approach the figure of Albert Camus. And then you look at the writings of Albert Camus. And then you start with not his novels, which entrance you in the way that fiction does, and actually is his entryway into historical understanding, because a story told can reach effortlessly past all the defenses of the rational mind. So if Camus had not written The Stranger, written in the style almost of film noir, or detectivist prose, if he had not written this highly readable and entertaining and yet relentlessly nuanced novel, he might never have made his way into public consciousness. Why? Because, philosophical writing, people don't necessarily, you better have your act together before you begin to offer that, because most of the time it's not going to draw too much attention to itself. So, for whatever that means. Camus wrote The Stranger, and as I understand it, this was his entryway into being someone that a reader, which is you or me now, right, would pay attention to, because it is so strikingly original and so entertaining and so just gosh darned readable. But past that, though, there's Camus' philosophical prose, and this is where I actually want to approach him in a certain sense. Why? Okay, here's why. I will tell you this. As a reader, myself, as a dedicated and practiced reader, and a problematic reader, when I'm reading the prose of Camus, which I've been, doing in one form or another for quite a while now, when I'm reading it in my mind, as I read all the different thoughts and the ways I'm trying to understand the thoughts and the ways I'm stepping back and trying to interpret them in my mind to make them make sense, as I'm reading, I encourage or encounter great resistance arising from all areas of my mind. Great resistance, because this is what they always say about philosophers. What is he really saying? What is this philosopher really saying? Is it not just words? Or what is really happening? Is something authentic happening that I really should pay attention to and laboriously enter into and offer it the generosity of my own attention in order to understand what might be said? And so any sensitive reader, I would venture to guess or presume, has this same kind of understanding going on, the phenomena of human resistance in the mind to what is, as it seems to impinge upon what it is that you want to know. So, here's one way out of that, a tool from my chest, and that is, do not look at Camus or any of some of these other solitary existentialist, visionary, unique, outcast, stranger writers. Do not look upon them as providing you with a series of arguments. And of course that's difficult to understand, because so much of our justice system, of our legal system, of our political system, of the way we understand ourselves as we go along the course of our careers, so much of the intellectual content that we are encouraged to bring to bear upon the problems that we face are in the form of arguments, one after the other. You don't have to call them arguments. You could also call them justifications. You could also call them rationales. And sometimes, if you're generous, you can call them explanations, which will give you kind of a more stable ground from which to be generous, if you're so inclined. The goodwill of any reader that any writer would solicit and yearn for, if possible, but not depend on. You can't depend upon it. It will stylistically weaken you if you depend upon it. Anyway, so consider then Camus. Imagine yourself as somebody trying to read this impenetrable scramble of words and arguments, and it's almost like too much. But then what I offer to you is, do not think of them as arguments. Take that off the slate. Do not think of them as arguments. Think of them, all of them, all at once, as a whole, as an offering of a method. As an offering of a method. And the points by points that you would previously have thought of as arguments, when you think of them as an offering of a method, now become different portrayals of consciousness as it comes to grapple with an insoluble problem. So think of it as methods. And when you do that, at least for me, it opens up another world of appreciation and understanding. For no longer do I carry the burden of having to be convinced. I don't have to worry about that. All I need do is wear the eyes that have been offered me by the consciousness of the writer whom I am reading. So, Camus, if I wear your eyes, I don't need to lend you my ears, because when I wear your eyes, I see your speech. I see your speech in my mind, and then I begin to understand it in my own way. And isn't that what art writing is to do? Isn't that what art speech is to do? To inspire us, to offer us a platform by which to be inspired to read and to interpret these signs, these portrayals, these imaginative depictions of method. So then we come to the point where we ask ourselves, okay, what method then is being offered? To which I say, at this point in time, and it's changed before, it appears this way now, and it will change again, I fear, as I go on. But the method is, what is being conveyed is a method of finding meaning. Of finding meaning in the world. Of finding meaning in our minds, meaning in our speech, meaning in the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart. And at one time we did have that. At one time we did have that. Imagine it that way with me for just a moment. Let the words of my mind and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. Whose sight? And with that question begins existential literature. Whose sight? Some of the existentialists are theists, and they're good. And some of the existentialists are atheists, and they are good. And some of the existentialists are agnostics, and they are good. And one of them is a crypto-theist, and he is perplexing. And I will not even mention his name at this point. It's mystifying enough as it is. It's not Camus. Camus is his reputation is that as an atheist, but we don't need to approach him in such an obvious yes or no way. That's not what I'm talking about. No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. He's offering us a method to come to know in our own way the meaning of life. But he starts then with these perplexing problems, such as the concept of the absurd. Let us begin with that. Setting aside the stranger, a novel, a story, a parable, which reaches into us in a way far more than any of the rigmarole that I'm throwing around now. You could go straight to that and find a way, and maybe, hopefully, I'll be able to offer some insights into that. Maybe, possibly, one would hope. But instead, it's a matter of looking at the myth of Sisyphus and looking at this, this stack of thoughts. Okay, yeah, what I was saying, the absurd. So one of the takeaways, that strange word, takeaways. What are the takeaways? It's offered in all the forms of public discourse, social media, newspapers. It's always been that way. It was there before there was all the social media of public discourse. But when you're reading a book, when you're grappling with things in that way, your understanding of what a takeaway is very, very different. Very, very, just much more subtle. And there's almost like an unconscious agreement with the reader when they're trying to see it that way, when they're trying to read with that kind of meaning. And what form of literature challenges us the most along these lines? It is poetry. especially the individualistic, surrealistic, existential, idiosyncratic poetry that some of us are guilty of writing. But what is good about that is it still brings to us the possibility of touching the awareness of a value of what reading and writing is at its most extreme. Extreme in the sense of comprehensibility, as well as estimation in the mind of one who reads it. Right? Anyway. But, Camus offers us certain insights into that as well. But let's come back to the concept of the absurd. So for Camus, the concept of the absurd is the offering of a way for us. It's a house. There is a house in the mind of my understanding of Camus' meaning. And over the threshold of it is written the words, the absurd. The absurd. It is a temple. I have deemed it to be that. I have built it with my own hands out of the bricks that Camus has given me. And I have built this chapel by the roadside of my life. I have built this chapel. It is the chapel of the absurd. It is one of many. Trust me. I have built this chapel, and over the threshold, I have inscribed the absurd. So I go inside of this chapel that Camus has offered me a way to build, and it is the absurd. And what I see are many ratios and ways of conceiving ratios of meaning. And it seems, as I come to understand it, with the words that I have and the thoughts that I have been given by my consciousness from one moment to the next, it seems that the ratios that describe the arc of the absurd have to do with the space of the disparity between what we expect from life and what we receive from life. And the ratio is the arc between what we expect and what we receive. And of course, the gap is wide. It's huge, it's large, and it changes in all these different, in many ways. And you could call it your expectation of a meaning that you will find. And then that's one end. And you call it your realization. Better word might be, in this sense, the fulfillment of that realization. It is an arc, and every arc is also a gap, and every gap is also a span, and every span is also the defining feature of a threshold, of course. But for Camus, to put it into the, the momentary brass tacks, which we always have to kind of fall back on, the absurd is the disparity between what we want and what we get, the disparity between our dreams and their fulfillment, the disparity between our need for timelessness and at the same time our submersion, is that a word? Submergence? into time, into circumstance, where we have to stay down there and learn how to breathe under the weight of circumstance, under the weight of diminished expectations, under the weight of frustrated forays into understanding, under the weight of all those things. I wonder, for some of us, it's the simple word that you could call it pain, or angst. Under the weight of these things, there is still the same need for a sense of meaning in it all. So the absurd for Camus is so many ways you could understand it. There's so many ways it appears to your mind from one moment to the next. But for the absurd, for Camus, it is a given. It is a given. It is the beginning of a philosophical quest. It is the beginning of a life, a life of the mind, a life of the soul, a life of the spirit. I wonder what he would say about some of those words. I wonder what Camus right now would say about me saying the word soul to him. Not that I want a Ouija board to evoke him and ask him this, but even so. So that's a starting point, the absurd, so in the face of the absurd, what then? So go back to the story then. Go back to the story of the stranger, just as a form in and of itself. The stranger depicts in scene after scene the life in Algiers of a solitary citizen, Mersault. As I read it, I say it, and there's good and bad in that, but it may or may not be French. Mersault. He goes through these experiences. His life progresses in impressions, in sights, and sounds. He seeks happiness. He has a basic understanding of what beauty is when he goes to the edge of the land and looks out at the sea. It's the sea, it's the sun, it's the waves. You see this again and again in Camus as a bank or an image vault or a storehouse from which he draws the necessary ingredients out of which he makes his metaphors and his settings. And Mersault is ensconced in this, and he lives in this. And of course, then there is the notion of time and the progression of time. This, as you read the kind of stark and simple relentlessness of the prose, with an awareness in the back of your mind of that certain feeling that you have in the textures of film noir, you get that sense of tedium, the kind of tedium if you're watching a French film where the actor in the angle of the dangle of the cigarette from his lips expresses it. And I'm not talking about when they start to talk with their cigarette in their mouth and you see the cigarette going up and down. That's a little bit different. That's an opening into actual comic possibilities. I think comics have taken that kind of visual vignette farther than would be appropriate to discuss here. But no, instead, the notion of tedium, but better yet, let's have a good old French word in here, ennui, right? And so you have that in the life of Mersault, the sensual splendor, the sights and sounds, and yet there's that sense of the ennui of it all, that sense of meaninglessness. And as a reader, that's where you begin to kind of relate to it in your mind. But then it comes to a point where there's the cutoff, not the cutoff necessarily, but the schism, the place in it where something gives way to something else. It's one kind of reality, and now, poof, it's another kind of reality. And that is where, in the book, The Stranger, where the protagonist, Mersault, commits a basically pointless murder. And there's part of the magic of the book is you don't ever really exactly find the reason for it. If you're looking for the reason for it, that too becomes part of what you must interrogate yourself as you make your way through the book. And so it's not like that. And then there's the part. So there's that schism. There's that act, that irrevocable act. And then there's the third movement where the law comes in, the justice theme comes in, the larger view of things, the larger view of life is expressed in the legal ramifications and the legal inevitabilities. They take over. Mersault is hauled off to jail, and he goes through the trial, and he's condemned, and he is visited by a priest to give, the old absolvement or the last rites or what have you. And at that point, there's a conflict. Something in Mersault says no. says no to what he's offered by the priest because it's never meant anything to him before anyway. But in that moment of saying no, something emerges from Mersault that was not there before, or at least not there in his consciousness. And so, there's some kind of like dramatic altercation. It's like it keeps you reading, of course, and then things change, and then Mersault is back alone in his jail cell, facing the inevitability of the legal system as it grinds on, and it's nighttime, and he looks out the window, up at the stars and the sky, and then he sees. He sees the stars, and he sees the stars as signs. He sees the stars in these constellations of meaning that were never clear to him before. He sees the stars, and he sees the signs, and it only makes sense to him. It is an epiphany to him only because it's in the backdrop of what he also sees with almost equal impact. Wordlessly, though, the senselessness of the universe, the muteness of the universe to his hitherto unfelt and uncalled out cry for meaning. The silence of the universe and the profusion and the richness of the stars and the signs that they make to his intuition all come upon him all at once. And does it result in, an idea to escape or, some statement of his innocence that will get him off the hook? No, does not do that. Instead, it's just a literary depiction of someone who comes to themselves, who sees something they had not seen before in the moment of their seeing it. And that is what that is what the stranger brings to us. Of an individual. So back to the philosophical idea of the absurd, of an individual who carries through in the course of his life, kind of an encounter with the absurd, even without knowing it. And then he comes to himself, and what you come away with, you ask yourself, okay, as you do so often in existential literature, what are the takeaways? What has happened in the book? You could almost say nothing. Nothing has happened in the book, but except this kind of epiphanic moment, which is not in the form of the voice of a god, or of a revelation, or of a word of the mouth, or a meditation of the heart being acceptable in thy sight, because thy sight is no sight. You see, what existentialism, as a literary form practiced by these sincere artists, gives us is the view of no one. The view of no one, which is so rich. As Emily Dickinson wrote in one of her gnomic poems, I am no one. Who are you? And this kind of literature brings us to that point. Okay, so let's look at Camus himself biographically, because that's there too. That's part of his mystique. And it's rich and it's huge, and I can only touch a minuscule part of it. But let's imagine Camus now in the context of his times, which resemble ours, and yet do not resemble ours, and yet do resemble ours. The context of the times of a society in turmoil and breakdown. And you could look at Camus' expression of the notion of the absurd in the light of this. We could have started looking at it this way long ago, and it would have been fruitful for us in this talk, but you could do it in a million other ways. But so in 1940, in September, France has fallen to the onslaught of the Nazis, And how could it be? Because France, militarily, industrially, in every way, was the equal, even more so in some ways, of Germany. And yet, what inexplicable reason was it that it collapsed so quickly? Well, that's a question to be answered by a political scientist, maybe, or the next Tolstoy. But that's not a question that can be answered by me at this point in time. But France fell, and then presto, just like in Athens, back in the time of the plague, at the time of Thucydides, we recollect that from the previous talk, suddenly, all at once it seemed, or maybe it's always this way, in France, the civic structure, the legal structure, the judicial structure, all of these logistical structures of social forms suddenly collapsed or fell apart or began to not work in one way or the other. And of course, people got to keep on living, and they're going to keep on doing what they need to keep on living. And so out of Paris, there was just like this stream of humanity going down into whatever in France wasn't Paris, i.e. south. Down in the south of Paris, everybody, this wild and formless and fraught exodus of humanity. And Camus was there. Camus was riding down the road. He had been working in a newspaper in Paris, and when Paris fell, it seemed maybe what it was, and I don't have the historical knowledge. I can only speculate and or interpret. It must have been the hope that you could reorganize society within the same limits, but under these different conditions. Well, they did. They got through it, of course, but it was a time of dire straits. Anyway, Camus, working on a newspaper in Paris, found himself in a car heading south with two other workers, and Camus, I believe, would be glad that I would call them workers, because for a newspaper, going back to that samizdat theme and the different forms of mass media and culture, going back to newspapers, a newspaper needs to have not just writers and editorialists and editors, but it also needs to have typesetters, skilled workers. And Camus as a journalist, let's go into that little part. That's a whole other aspect of the genius of Camus. Camus as a journalist expressed his moral feeling in really very specific ways. And, I know that he identified with the typesetters and the other artisans. And it seems to me that he was with these typesetters, workers in other words, in this car heading into southern France. And don't talk about gas stations or, rest stops or any of these things. People are just getting in there, whatever they got, and going till the wheels come off without knowing what's going to be around the next bend in the road. And so the newspaper that Camus worked for found itself, relocated along with all the rest of the country into all these various points and areas in southern France. And Camus and his two other workers on the newspaper with him stayed with it, the car, until the wheels came off. But it worked. They got there. They got where they needed to go. They got to Lyon, which is where they were sent. And so it was there in Lyon that they arrived. And there in Lyon, if I'm pronouncing it right, like I say, I pronounce like I read. It's a form of fidelity, if fidelity to folly. They got to Lyon, and they made it there, and the car just fell apart at that point. The steam was coming out from under the trunk, and they piled out of the car. At last they arrived, but the car was like ruined. Camus rushed to the trunk of the car. The steam was coming out. He must have. He certainly took precautions in terms of stuff. He opened up that trunk. Woof, the steam came out, but he found what he wanted to find. His manuscript. Part of the manuscript. He had a lot more to go with it, but a lot of the manuscript, to the myth of Sisyphus, was saved. and it was not burnt up in the trunk of the car that was self-destructing as they arrived there in Lyon. Thank goodness for that. But Camus couldn't work on it for a while after that because the newspaper work was pressing upon him. But here's a manifestation of the weirdness of the social breakdown. It seems to me, this is a mystery in the life of Camus. It seemed like at one moment it was a newspaper in Paris, and then the society collapsed, and then there was, Vichy France and all of that stuff. And then, just like that, from one moment to the next, suddenly the editorial policy of this newspaper just became just senseless and just became pap, as we used to call it in the 1970s. Or, became drivel, or became Kant, not Kant, not Kant the philosopher, but Kant. You know what I mean? The cliched kind of self-interested, calculative, shallow, mediocre talk of public consciousness. Kant, drivel. What did Kierkegaard call it? Kierkegaard called it twaddle. He had a good word for it. And Camus was working on the newspaper, and suddenly the editorial policies were just like, what was the guy's name? Pétain? The president of Vichy France. Pétain would come down and concoct all these propaganda rallies, and he would have these, old, decrepit World War I veterans who would hoist their berets into the air and hail the new France, Vichy France, and it was just ridiculous, and it was utterly phony, and it was just, social and political and journalistic and aesthetic quackery, and it was just coming at him all the time. This is a question for us. So, I hope not to be a little bit, irreverent. I wonder, Albert, what did you write at that time? Did you write what you had to write? That's a terrible thing to ask, no, but I'm sure that you would answer it straight up, But, well, who knows? But that happened first, but then, okay, I do know this. Some of those hardcore, more blatantly anti-Semitic kind of, developments and news transmission started to come down, and Camus certainly didn't want nothing with that. And so I don't want to act like I'm questioning Camus as a compromiser with circumstances, even though he did need a job just like everybody else did. But nevertheless, and it's okay, history gives us a reprieve in terms of the protection of our idealism, because of course, evidently, if you're a corrupt newspaper editor and you've got Albert Camus on your staff, there comes a point where you're going to have to fire him. And fire him they did. And so now, jobless, he's on his own. But he's got his manuscript, his partial manuscript of the myth of Sisyphus. And so let us consider what he was doing, in the context of those kind of circumstances. So with that, the myth of Sisyphus, and I want to say, do you mind? One more thing about the myth of Sisyphus. Yes, let's put it this way. So that little biographical kind of thing that goes in and out of from the unknown to the unknown. That's there for us to contemplate. But things, of course, were happening fast. This was like about 1940. Camus was married twice, and his first marriage. Well, let me just say this really quickly, and this is a whole other area. We'll only be able to touch on it, of course. But Camus was a pied noir, if I'm saying it right. Camus was a child of colonial France. Camus was a child of a society that was established as a far-flung outcropping, colonial outcropping, of the Empire of France in another land. Talk about stranger in a strange land. Happens in all these countries, that establish these colonial outposts. All these other countries, not just France, but England, Germany, Italy, Spain, Scandinavian countries. These societies developed in these other lands under the structural powers of the overseeing empire. And Camus comes out of that context. And that's a whole other look and a whole other theme and a whole other way to approach Camus. He was Algerian, in other words. He was a native of Algeria. He was not born in France. The only other one who was born nearby as a literary figure of great eminence was Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine was also born in Algeria, but Camus was born. Actually, this is a little bit legendary, and this could be like a poetic kind of folklore thing. In Camus' last unfinished novel, The First Man, Camus depicts a fictional story of his birth, and I won't go into it too much, except to, for just a moment, say tentatively that it could be that Camus and St. Augustine were born in the same place. It all depends if Bonnet, as Camus calls it in The First Man, is the same town or city or settlement as Hippo, which St. Augustine called it when he referred to his birthplace. I don't know. But that's a mystery, a certain kind of mystery. Well, anyway, so Camus, in other words, so circumstances were such that Camus, yes, he was married, his first wife, and I think that whole relationship took form in Algeria, and in Algiers, and Camus was young, and her name is spelled Hie, and there's an accent mark over there. I have no idea how you would pronounce it, but I seem to think that they were talented bohemians in a provincial town, finding out of themselves the good things in life that inspired them, an innocent and youthful and exuberant and bohemian existence. And yet, what was making these young individuals so unique was also that which was, troubling them. And out of this, of course, would come the forms of their art. And as I understand it, his first wife had an issue with I guess it would be morphine at that time. I'm not sure what they would call it, but it was it was a disordered marriage, romantic and intense, and it didn't last all that long. But by the time Camus, skipping ahead a whole lot, perhaps haphazardly in the biographical timeline of Camus, by the time he left Paris in the onrush of the German occupation and all, eventually he made his way back to Algeria, and he was married once more to Francine. And I guess Francine's family was more prosperous than Camus' family. This too will be a theme that we might have all that much time to go into. Camus was, though he was Pied Noir, though he was a member of French colonial society, that doesn't mean that every French national was privileged. Quite the contrary. Camus grew up very, very poor. It's very, very significant to understand that Camus' father was a casualty of the First World War. I believe it was the Battle of the Marne. Camus' father died, I believe, at the age of something like 29 at the Marne. Camus was 3 years old, so undoubtedly, who knows if Camus had a memory of laying eyes on his father. But he did have his father's war medals and other mementos of that nature. He did visit his father's grave after the Second World War, where he noted in his writing about it, in his depiction about it, Camus noted the silence, another theme, the silence of the surrounding countryside, and also noting from the dates on the tombstone of his father that Camus was now quite older than his father was when he died. Camus offers us insights like this in his voluminous writings, kind of like lyrical and introspective insights. It's part of his personality and his style. You will find sometimes more of Camus in those kind of writings than you might in his more major works. That's another way to approach him, actually, in understanding him. But be that as it may, so after September 1940, he was back in Algiers. He was married to Francine. They had a place to live in Oran, which is where the plague was set. Camus found the same, well, I'm sure the scenes when Camus was living in Oran find their way fulfilled and transmuted into the scenes of Oran in his book, The Plague. And he makes so much, of a city that is not that beautiful, and yet the beautiful things are nearby, but you don't see them so much. The city is built in such a way that you don't have to even know that it is by the sea. And yet, in the book The Plague, set in Iran, the sea is a presence that the characters, if they're sensitive to it, they can look out the window and just get a sense of the feeling in the air that the sea is nearby. And this becomes, important moments to note when you're trying to understand the inner life of the characters as it flows through these different, sets of circumstances that constitute the novel. But anyway, so Camus is back in Oran, and he's there for a while, and he doesn't like it, and but he's doing something good because he's responding to the needs of the time, which are chaotic and just bad. For example, the schools suddenly, by issue of the orders of Vichy France, Jews can't go to school. In the public schools, Jews can't go to school. So suddenly there's a need to educate a whole bunch of children. And so, for a while, and I wonder what kind of teacher he was. For a while, Camus was a jack-of-all-trades teacher for Jewish children in Oran in the early part of 1940 and 1941. And he taught geography, and he taught French, and he taught philosophy. Boy, that must have been good, And he taught a lot of things. And I'll just mention really quick, he was an extremely skilled soccer player also in youth. So did he teach soccer at that time? Maybe, maybe not. Because there's this other aspect of Camus to consider. He was tubercular. And how strange that in so many pictures of Camus, the cigarette is hanging out from his lips. It's a prop. It makes him oh so Bogart-like. But yes, he was tubercular. Sometimes it caused him significant significant challenges. And it was in Oran when he had an attack of it. And the diagnosis was that it wasn't no longer in any one place, but it was now more of an issue. And so, it became more and more of an issue that Camus had tuberculosis. And his Jewish doctor, let me mention this also, there came another edict from Vichy France that Jews could only occupy 10% of the quote-unquote professional jobs. The doctors and the lawyers and the dentists, they could only be 10% Jewish. So, and Camus' doctor was Jewish. Dr. Cohen, I think was his name, who advised him, I don't know if another summer and winter in Oran would be good for those lungs of yours. Maybe you'd better go on back to France. And so Camus, after several months in Oran, back to France he went via Marseille and up into France. And I think it was Chambon or, I don't remember the name of the village where he was, but it was there in that village back in France that Camus was working on the bringing in more of the finishing touches. As I understand it, Francine was there also, and their fingers were cold because heat was hard to come by, and Camus was scrambling and scribbling out the pages of the myth of Sisyphus, under these kind of circumstances, you see. So when you read this monument of thought, so troubling and so challenging and so enriching, it's always sometimes good to imagine the circumstances under which it was written. When did the hand first hold the pen or the pencil that first met the page? Or maybe it was a typewriter. After all, he was a journalist. It's already the 20th century. But did he have a blanket wrapped around him? Were his fingers numb and stiff? How could it be in such uncomfortable circumstances that such inspired thoughts could flow? Well, this is part of the mystery you could bring to mind, when you read this book. At any rate, the book got written, and the gentleman had a way with he could make his way in the world and get the notice of who he needed to get the notice of. And The Stranger had already been published and had already met with success. And but it was the myth of Sisyphus, as I understand it, that is the book, I think, along with The Stranger. But it was around this time that this book came to the attention of Jean-Paul Sartre, if I'm saying it right. And Sartre was already established as a writer. I think Sartre stayed in France the whole time, and he did some significant French underground work, and that's a whole other story. But what's significant in this particular story is he was reviewing books, and Sartre had come across his transom, The Stranger, and the myth of Sisyphus. And there were those who, as much as they liked The Stranger because it was such a good read, there were those who, the myth of Sisyphus, they couldn't make heads or tails of it. They thought it was tedious or what have you. I mean, some of them thought it was dramatic and defeatist or cynical or pointless because they reacted to Camus' use of certain dramatic depictions of extreme absurdity, and I don't know, one reason or the other, but not Sartre. Sartre got it. I guess sometimes if you're an existentialist, if you get it at certain points, why, hey, that makes you an existentialist. And Sartre got it. And so he was able to look at the myth of Sisyphus, and he was able to kind of examine some of the key metaphors in the myth of Sisyphus. And he was able not only to see the value of it, but also to critique it in a certain way. For example, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus' notion of the absurd is, as I have presented it to you, but he takes it, of course, several steps farther than that at different points in the book. And he gives these illustrative examples of the absurd, of the way, for example, in our yearning for meaning, that the signs of meaning that we seek to see do not provide us with that meaning. This sense of just the vacuousness or the emptiness of the signs and symbols of communication. And one of his metaphors is the image that you might conjure to your mind if you're looking at an old-fashioned telephone booth and you see somebody on the other side talking into the phone and you cannot understand or hear the words, but you see the gestures. So you just see one part of the communicative act. And for Camus, it's an illustration of the muteness to meaning of all of our signs. But, because it's as if, and this is to extend the metaphor further along the lines that I have decided to do, presumptuously or not, imagine yourself looking at someone dancing, but you can't hear the music. Well, sometimes that can be very interesting, but Camus uses the metaphor a certain way, of looking through a telephone booth and seeing somebody talking on the phone and you can't hear what he's saying. For Camus, that's like an illustration of the muteness and the absurdity and the senselessness of the ways that we communicate, And, okay, so Sartre, in his review, he picked up on this, and he linked it, as I understand, it was a creative, literary, critical insight. He linked that to previous traditions of French literature in Voltaire. For example, there's one, Voltaire, as a satirist, and he's in the tradition of Camus. Voltaire, he wrote about, he wrote Candide, right? Of course, he wrote Zelig or Zadig, and he also wrote this book, I can't remember the title, something Magna. It was about a giant. It was about a giant from another planet who came to Earth and walked upon the Earth. This is great, actually. The metaphor is great, even though I've never read the book. Voltaire did this. He talked about a giant who came to Earth who was so tall and so huge, and his ears were so way up there that he couldn't hear anything from down below. He was so high up and far above, he couldn't see anything down below. So he actually visited the earth and set foot upon the earth, but he concluded in his mind that it was uninhabited because he had no sight nor sound of any beings down below. And so he left, thinking that the earth was uninhabited. And so this is a metaphorical and literary precedent of what Camus might have been doing in one of his many creative ways, that he elucidated the concept of the absurd. And as I understand it was Sartre who was able to provide for that. How much more time should I be doing what I'm doing? Okay, good. All right. So that means I'm going to have a little drink of water here. So what else do I want to say about Sartre's understanding of Camus' book? Well, it's epoch-making in the story of these writers and this tradition of insight, if we can call it that, of artistic insight, of art speech, of existentialism, continental philosophy, 20th century philosophy, if you want to call it that. This was the first time that Sartre and Camus encountered each other through Sartre's review of this book. So talk about a creative relationship of understanding reached through the exchange of literary works. You will have Sartre and Camus as a good and primary example of how such a thing can be. So it became very important. But how about I go on another point of departure from there? Okay, Walker, please do. Okay. Shall I consider the dialogic form? Okay, let's see where that leads. Suddenly an image appears of Plato's uncle. Of Plato's uncle Critias. Critias? Critias? I'm going to say Critias. An uncle of Plato's. Critias. Some kind of legal mind. Some kind of legal scholar. Perhaps a lawyer. Critias, who uttered some kind of statement to the effect that human beings create the gods. Human beings create the gods so as to have an overarching authority to validate their earthly conceptions of justice. In other words, an image of seeing or understanding projected out into the cosmos as some greater authority, as some greater form, so as to have a reference point, a higher reference point for our own understanding of good and bad and of right and wrong. Such a statement could be heretical. Such a statement could be kind of a form of like skepticist humanism. At any rate, no matter what you might call it, is there something else I could call it though? Seems like I want to have my thoughts go out in threes. So what could also I say about what Critias was saying? Well, let's just play with it a little bit. Does he mean one God? Or does he mean many gods? If he means one God, well then that leads to one set of perplexities. If he means many gods, well, in a way that might be easier, because as we come to understand the tradition of the gods from the Greeks, when there's many gods, then we can kind of understand them as dramatic forms, because then they do dramatic things. They get into conflicts, they satisfy their desires, they do their intrigues, they behave actually reprehensibly, which gives us, an acceptable awareness of the fact that the gods are flawed. That's one way to look at it that way. But anyway, no matter what it does, it's just a characteristic of how we think about these ultimate issues of justice and meaning, because so often we've learned how to do it in reference to some external agency, perhaps an external agency of omniscience, or maybe just another set of contending powers. It could be that also. But regardless, it's this transdimensional, agency that we refer our own problems to, so to speak. Which is why any existentialist, who takes the, agnostic path, which I suggest to you is not so much a path as a style. I believe theism and atheism are not actually meaningful theological questions. I believe they're just styles. And, in saying that, I'm pretending that I'm making some kind of provocative statement. But at any rate, set that aside for a moment, because what I want to say is, so for Camus, and this is other writers of that ilk, moral writers who are offering us not arguments necessarily, but methods, one after the other, methods to find meaning. Camus, perhaps not by design, is giving us a view of the world and the cosmos coming from out of us, from out of our inner being, but with reference not to an external agency of transcendent authority of any kind or of any multiplicity. Rather, Camus is offering us a way to understand a world of meaning enacted, viewed by no one. The perspective of no one. And that, stylistically and aesthetically, is a meaningful conception of a perspective, the perspective of no one. And so with that in mind, then consider Camus' use of the myth of Sisyphus. We've talked about the myth of Sisyphus as a book with a history, with ideas in it and ways to approach those ideas, but we haven't talked about Sisyphus himself. And so we should talk about Sisyphus himself for just a moment. Sisyphus is a mythical figure. And there's a lot about Sisyphus that has no part in Camus' interpretation of Sisyphus. For example, Sisyphus's ploys and his cons and his lies and his tricks and his opportunism. Sisyphus, who, because of his trickery and his cunning and his guile, offended the gods to such a degree that they had to do away with him. And many times the Greek gods, to do away with someone was pretty easy. Bring in Artemis. She likes target practice. Apollo too. You could do a lot of different things to do away with some mortal who has transgressed some arbitrary limit that you have set. But this Sisyphus, it was different. Because you couldn't get him. He could outsmart you every time. For example, they sent the god of death himself to Sisyphus. Hades undertook it himself to go to Sisyphus and to shackle Sisyphus and to bring him to the underworld. Yes, the god of the underworld himself, Hades, approached Sisyphus with a set of shackles. Sisyphus, said Hades, your time has come. Put these shackles on, and I will lead you down to Hades and judgment. and the land of the underworld. Oh, said Hades. Excuse me. Oh, said Sisyphus to Hades. Sisyphus said to Hades, these shackles, they're like what? Like handcuffs? Yes, said Hades, they're like handcuffs. Put them on now. Sisyphus said, ah, great god Hades, as a mortal, I am fascinated by the actions and the machinations of you gods, and I have yet to see something of such cunning and invention as these, what do you call them, shackles, handcuffs? Yes, yes, shackles, handcuffs, says Hades. Oh, how do they work? What do you mean, how do they work? I'm a god. I put these shackles on you. What do you mean, how do they work? No, well, I am a human, and I'm asking you, Hades, how do they work? Could you show me, in your greatness and your great godlike power? Show me how do these handcuffs work? Oh, okay, said Hades. I'll show you. And to make a long story short, that is how Sisyphus tricked Hades into handcuffing himself. And now Hades was shackled. The god of the underworld was shackled. The god of death could not move. Because of this, upon earth, death could not be. Oh, but the Greeks are not utopians, and it's not anything but something kind of grotesque. An order of nature was disrupted. People could not die. Hades was shackled. And there's a lot of grisly depictions that are very, very vivid of the chaos that occurred on Earth when people could not die. Obviously, it couldn't go on like this. And so, how did it work out? Well, Zeus had to, as the executive director, Zeus had to resort to some other way. And Zeus said, okay, let's just cut to the chase. Ares, you are the god of war. Kill Sisyphus. So Ares, the god of war, killed Sisyphus. And Sisyphus's body was left on the ground. And Sisyphus, his spirit, came down to the underworld. Still, Sisyphus, bodiless or not, remains Sisyphus. At the very gates of, well, actually, I believe he just crossed the river Styx, where he was met by Persephone herself, the queen of the underworld, who said, Sisyphus, your time has come. Come into this world now, where you belong, now that you are dead. And Sisyphus said to Persephone, an approach he had not used before on Hades, to Persephone, Sisyphus said, oh, great goddess, the statutes and forms by which we worship you go on and sustain us poor, miserable human beings in our understanding and our reverence for you. Oh, without these standards of decorum, oh, Queen Persephone, how could the universe, the cosmos, go on? And Persephone, somewhat mystified, said, yes, I guess you're right. Yeah, how could it go on? It couldn't. Anyway, come with me. But Sisyphus had something more to say. Sisyphus said, alas, O great Queen Persephone, I haven't been buried yet. He had given his wife instructions not to bury his body because of the trick he wanted to play. Ah, Persephone, I haven't been buried yet. I still have to, my body must be buried, otherwise a standard of decorum given by you gods will be violated. I must see to that. I'll tell you what, said Sisyphus, the ever-aggressive negotiator. I'll tell you what, give me 3 days. I'll go back up to the world and make sure that my body is buried so that the proper standards of decorum can be followed, and then I will come back down, and then you can take me into your underworld. And bewildered Persephone, while she was trying to figure out what he was saying, she decided to trust him. That was a mistake. Go ahead, Sisyphus, come back in 3 days. Sisyphus did not come back in 3 days. Sisyphus came back into his body once again. Ah, he must have thought, I tricked Hades. I tricked Persephone. I have tricked my fellow mortals time and time again. Ah, I am Sisyphus, the greatest trickster of all. But the gods remain the gods, and the mortals remain the mortals, and Sisyphus is immortal, even if he's trickier than the gods. And Zeus said to his emissary, to his messenger, to his trusty and effective worker, his fast-talking, swift-moving, no-nonsense when he needs to be, evidently, that son, Hermes. Hermes, it's your turn now. You are the conductor of souls. Conduct that soul to the underworld. And Sisyphus couldn't escape Hermes. Very interesting. Sisyphus ended up at last in the underworld. And now it was the gods' turn. The gods said, the tricks that you played upon us have no bearing here in our world now. Sisyphus, now you go into a different dimension of the evolution of your being and the consequences of the way that you lived before. From now on, Sisyphus, this is our decree, our punishment, our jurisdiction, our dominion, and our justification, and it is utterly final. Sisyphus, you are to roll the boulder up the hill with great, great toil. And then you'll get to the top of the hill, and then, oddly enough, the same rules of time and space apply down here. The rock will roll back down the hill. And then, Sisyphus, you'll just have to start all over again and roll that rock up the hill once more. And it will be this way for all eternity. And so that's Sisyphus, rolling the rock up and down the hill, rolling the rock up and down the hill. And like any myth, it goes on and on. It goes on and on in your psyche. But also like any myth, it is fodder, food for thought, sustenance, inspiration, and energy for the poets. And Camus, as a poet, who teaches us to see, as a poet does, not by argument, but by imaginative portrayals of methods of finding meaning in life, Camus draws from that myth of Sisyphus the lineaments of a heroic figure, of not only a heroic figure, but even more than a heroic figure, an exemplary, a uniquely exemplary human figure in the face of the absurd. And so this is why this book is called The Myth of Sisyphus. Camus tells us that Sisyphus, having been punished with the ultimate expression of what absurdity is, and in that moment, for Sisyphus, for Camus seeing Sisyphus, that moment of absurdity is to be condemned for all eternity to expend maximum effort, utter and complete and total effort out of your very being, and yet in return have nothing at all. Just the rock rolling back down the hill. And not only that, it goes on and on and on for all eternity. Well, Camus, I suppose, would say to us, like Meursault looking out the window of his jail cell into the teeming night sky with all of its stars and all of its signs, as if the soul is speaking to him out of the immensity of its emptiness. The corollary of that in mythic eternity is Sisyphus rolling that rock up the hill and then back down again, and rolling up the hill and then back down again. And then, okay, and I'll bring it to a wind up here, because this is a challenging statement from Camus. And every turn of his reasoning, there's always challenging statements. But Camus asks us this. He asks us, or does he compel us? He says, he utters, he states, we must imagine Sisyphus as happy. How can we imagine Sisyphus as happy? Well, words obviously fail us, but as a method of the realization of meaning, what Sisyphus is expressing is, even though it comes to nothing, it is an expression of his whole being. It is an expression of his whole being under the watchful eyes of the gods and the watchful eyes of the humans, like you and me, who read it in this book. So we must imagine Sisyphus as happy, and we must imagine ourselves also as, for that moment, in this moment, with the gift that Camus has given us, for that moment, we share an image of the world along with the gods, mediated through the creative transmission and the creative work and the art speech of Albert Camus. And it's there for us before our reader's eye and in our minds all the time. So it gives us an image, of a human image that transcends any previous way we've ever understood the human image to be. And yet it does so out of something brought out from deep within in the alchemy of art and artistic presence and artistic prose and artistic process and artistic work. So, this is my talk. And as always, I thank you so much, Eric. It does me so much good to get this out of my mind and to see it in front of me. And another page, another task. That's how it is. Anyway, good to see everybody. So long for now, and I'll have more for you as we go on, if the gods allow, and if it's worth it, and I know it is. Thank you for your heroic listening. All right.